Try beating me, boy. 40 years undefeated, and you think a cheap suit from a thrift store makes you an attorney? Richard Vance sneered, his corporate rings clicking loudly against the polished mahogany table. With a sharp, practiced flick of his wrist, he grabbed Marcus Sterling's meticulously prepared 5-0 page motion, ripped it completely in half, and tossed the shredded pieces directly onto the courtroom floor like cheap confetti. The federal court doesn't have time for a first grader's book report. Why would I waste my breath arguing property law with a broke black man who can't even afford a real briefcase? Look at you. You belong in a mugshot, not a courtroom. Go home, Marcus. Your people are better at cleaning these floors than standing on them. Next time, bring a brain. The entire federal courtroom fell completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to breathe. Richard Vance stood there, a multi-million-dollar celebrity lawyer, wearing a smirk that had broken hundreds of lives before. He thought this hearing was already over. He thought money had already won. What Richard didn't know was the explosive secret hidden inside Marcus's remaining files, a devastating truth that was about to turn this entire courtroom into an absolute crime scene for his 40-year career. Before we dive into the chilling details of how this arrogant titan was brought to his knees, make sure you don't miss a single second of this incredible journey. Drop your current location and local time in the comments below right now so we can see where our global family is watching from, and hit that subscribe button to join us for more powerful stories of justice and truth. To truly understand how this explosive courtroom confrontation began, we must step out of the sterile, fluorescent lights of the federal building and travel back to 5:30 inches the morning on the west side of Chicago. Long before the city's financial district woke up, Marcus Sterling was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on Pulaski Road. The ceiling above him bore the dark watermarks of winter leaks, and outside, the low, metallic rumble of the morning train shook the window panes every 11 minutes. Marcus sat in the quiet, listening to the heavy, uneven breathing of his 68-year-old mother, Clara, sleeping in the adjacent room. Clara's heart was failing, and her medical bills were a silent, suffocating weight that Marcus carried on his shoulders every single day. Marcus was 34 years old, a man with deep, tired eyes and a jawline hardened by years of quiet endurance. He walked barefoot into the small kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath his feet. He brewed a pot of cheap store-brand coffee, the only minor luxury he allowed himself in a life stripped down to the bare essentials. As he poured the dark liquid into a chipped ceramic mug, the world around him remained cast in stark, monolithic shades of gray. From the day he was born, Marcus lived in a world completely devoid of color, a rare, total congenital achromatopsia that meant his eyes could only process pure black, pure white, and the infinite shades of gray between them. To Marcus, the city was not a vibrant canvas of neon and gold. It was a structure of shadows, lines, and textures. He had learned to navigate the world through absolute precision, focusing entirely on the hard facts, the sharp edges, and the fine print that others completely overlooked. By 7:45 a.m., after ensuring his mother had taken her morning heart medication and preparing a small plate of toast for her, Marcus walked into his office. The Westside Community Legal Aid Center was located in a narrow, run-down brick building sandwiched between a laundromat and a boarded-up liquor store. The carpet inside was worn down to the bare threads. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a relentless, maddening hum, and the old metal filing cabinets groaned every time they were opened. This was where Marcus worked as a solo attorney, earning less than $32,000 a year. Every single day, the desperate, broken, and forgotten people of the neighborhood flooded through his door. They brought him their eviction notices, their predatory loan agreements, and their unpayable medical debts. Everyone in the community knew Marcus was vastly overqualified for this place. His closest friend from law school, Kendra Vance, who now worked at a prestigious corporate firm downtown, told him the exact same thing during their rare coffee meetings. Marcus, you graduated near the top of your class at a state university. You pass the bar on your very first try, and you have a sharper legal mind than half the partners at my firm. Why are you burying yourself alive in a basement office, helping people who can't even pay your filing fees? Marcus always gave Kendra the exact same calm, unwavering response. Because the people in this neighborhood don't need another lawyer who bills $500 an hour just to tell them they lose. They need someone who knows the law and refuses to look away. What Marcus never talked about, what he kept locked deep inside his chest, was the quiet pain of watching his peers climb into high-rise glass offices while he struggled to keep the lights on. He had chosen this path because he believed, with every fiber of his being, that the law was supposed to be a shield for the weak, not a club for the rich. But the fragile, quiet safety of Marcus's world completely shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, when a woman named Mrs. Elijah walked into his office. Mrs. Elijah was 82 years old, her hands bent by a lifetime of hard labor, her face lined with the history of the neighborhood. She was the matriarch of the Greenwood Apartments, a historic, three-story brick housing complex that had stood as a sanctuary for 150 low-income black families for over 6 decades. The land beneath Greenwood, however, had suddenly become the most valuable dirt in the city. The neighborhood was gentrifying at a terrifying speed, and Vanguard Corp., a massive, multi-billion-dollar real estate development conglomerate, had just finalized a $55 million luxury commercial project. The Greenwood Apartments were the final obstacle standing in their way. To clear the path, Vanguard Corp. didn't offer fair compensation. Instead, they unleashed a brutal campaign of forced relocation, handing the residents predatory, fraudulent eviction notices and offering a measly, insulting $5,000 per household to pack up their lives and disappear into the streets. When the terrified residents tried to resist, Vanguard Corp. hired the most ruthless weapon money could buy, Richard Vance, senior partner at Vance, Sterling and Associates. Richard was a celebrity lawyer who wore $4,000 custom Italian suits, drove a silver sports car that cost more than Marcus's entire apartment building, and boasted a terrifying, unblemished record of 40 years without a single loss in property litigation. When Richard Vance learned that a broke, solo black attorney from the West Side had filed a federal injunction to stop the eviction, he didn't just laugh. He decided to turn Marcus Sterling into an example. God turned to his lead associate in his penthouse office, looking down over the city, and whispered, "This isn't a lawsuit. This is an extermination. I am going to bury this boy so deep he'll forget he ever passed the bar exam." Marcus knew the odds were impossible, but as he looked at the tears in Mrs. Elijah's old eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away. He accepted the case for $0, completely unaware of the absolute hell Richard Vance was about to unleash upon his life. The psychological warfare began exactly 48 hours after Marcus filed the preliminary injunction. Richard Vance did not send his response through the standard legal channels or electronic court portals. Instead, he chose to make it personal, public, and deliberately cruel. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus was sitting in the sterile, white-walled intensive care unit of Mount Sinai Hospital. His mother, Clara, lay in the bed, her frail body hooked to a rhythmic, pulsing heart monitor, after suffering a severe hypertensive crisis brought on by the stress of their rising debts. The room was silent, except for the low, mechanical hum of the oxygen machine. Without warning, the heavy wooden door to the hospital room swung open. 2 young, broad-shouldered corporate couriers dressed in immaculate black suits marched into the room, ignoring the medical staff. They did not look at Marcus. Instead, the lead courier walked directly to the side of Clara's bed, reached over her frail, trembling arm, and slammed a thick, white envelope directly onto the digital display of her heart monitor. The glass cracked slightly under the impact. Clara gasped, her heart rate spiking violently on the monitor as the alarms began to beep frantically. Marcus Sterling, the courier, announced in a loud, booming voice that echoed through the quiet ward, "You have been served." This is a formal cross-complaint from Vanguard Corporation. Retract your injunction by 5 p.m. tomorrow, or our client is suing you personally for tortious interference and defamation. The damages are set at $2 million. Marcus stood up, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles turned white. "Get out of this room," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying quiet rage. "Now." The courier smirked, adjusting his silk tie. "Just delivering the message, counselor. Mr. Vance said to tell you that if you don't sign the withdrawal, you should stop saving for your mother's treatment and start saving for your own bankruptcy." The following morning, Marcus walked into the lion's den. He refused to back down, demanding an emergency conference at the headquarters of Vance, Sterling and Associates on the 50th floor of the Willis Tower. The contrast was suffocating. The lobby was a massive expanse of cold white marble, illuminated by custom crystal chandeliers. When Marcus entered the penthouse conference room, Richard Vance was sitting at the head of a 20-foot polished mahogany table. He didn't stand up. He was flanked by 4 junior associates and a private stenographer. On the table sat a single porcelain cup of espresso that cost more than Marcus's shoes. "Ah, the neighborhood savior has arrived," Richard Vance mocked, leaning back in his leather chair and swirling an expensive gold pen between his fingers. Goss scanned Marcus's faded gray suit with total disgust. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Marcus. Look around you. This single room generates more revenue in an hour than your entire zip code sees in a year. You graduated from a third-tier public school, and you think you can step onto my canvas?" "The law applies to everyone, Mr. Vance," Marcus said, sitting down at the opposite end of the table, placing his single battered leather folder in front of him. Vanguard Corp forged the relocation consent forms for the Greenwood residents. That is a federal crime. Richard Vance let out a loud, booming laugh that caused his junior associates to snicker in unison. Gon leaned forward, his blue eyes turning cold as ice, dripping with absolute racial contempt. "The law doesn't care about your feelings, boy. The law belongs to the people who can buy the ink to write it. I have won every single property case for 40 years because I know how to erase people like you from the record. You are a broke black man playing a game you don't have the chips for. Sign the dismissal. If you don't, I won't just take your law license. I will take that rundown shack you call an office, and I will make sure you and your mother are sleeping on the very sidewalks you're trying to protect. You are a zero, Marcus. A complete non-entity." Marcus didn't flinch. He looked directly into Vance's eyes, his face a mask of iron determination. "I'll see you in court, Mr. Vance." Vance's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark, dangerous scowl. "You want a war, boy? I'll give you an execution." The execution began at exactly 4:15 on a Friday afternoon. A massive courier truck pulled up to the curb outside Marcus's narrow West Side office, blocking the driveway. 2 men began unloading heavy, reinforced cardboard boxes, stacking them one by one inside his tiny reception area, until the narrow room was completely cut in half. It was Richard Vance's signature move, a brutal strategy known in the corporate world as paper warfare. Inside those 5 boxes were over 3,000 pages of legal documents, interrogatories, specialized requests for admissions, hyper-technical document demands, and deposition notices for every single surviving elder resident of the Greenwood apartments. To make the move completely fatal, Vance had used a rare procedural loophole to set the response deadline for Monday morning at 9:00 a.m. Marcus had exactly 48 hours to review, analyze, and write formal legal objections to 3,000 pages of complex corporate paperwork. If he missed a single document, or if he filed even one response 20 seconds late, the federal court would automatically waive all his objections, throw out his injunction, and grant Vanguard Corp the immediate right to demolish the building. It was a slow, legal suffocation, designed to break a solo attorney with no budget and no staff. To make matters worse, at 7:30 that Saturday evening, Marcus's cell phone rang, It was the night nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. His mother's blood pressure had spiked again, and she was crying, terrified of the men who had violated her hospital room the day before. Marcus stood alone in his dark office, staring at the mountains of white paper under the buzzing fluorescent lights. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the steady, maddening drip of a leaky pipe behind the drywall. For a single, terrifying moment, the crushing weight of reality hit him. He was one man, completely broke, fighting a multi-billion-dollar empire with an army of Ivy League lawyers. He felt a cold sweat break out on his neck, his chest tightening so hard he could barely breathe. He thought about his mother, about his bank account, which contained less than $400, and about the sheer, arrogant power of Richard Vance. The temptation to pick up the phone, dial Vance's private number, and utter the words, "I withdraw," was a physical pull in his gut. The pain would stop. The pressure would vanish. He could go back to simple, safe paperwork. But then, Marcus looked down at the top page of the first box. It was a deposition demand for Mrs. Elijah, asking her to verify 40 years of tax returns or face immediate eviction. He saw the cold, calculated cruelty written in every single paragraph of Vance's font. If he quit, 150 black families would be pushed into the freezing Chicago winter so a billionaire could build a luxury parking garage. Marcus took a deep, shaky breath. He walked over to the old coffee maker, poured a mug of cold, bitter dregs, and sat down at his metal desk. He turned on his old desktop computer, its cooling fan groaning loudly in the quiet room. To Marcus, the thousands of pages before him didn't represent a chaotic sea of color or prestige. Because of his total color blindness, they were a perfectly structured matrix of black ink on stark white background. He began to read. He didn't skim. He didn't rush. He used his precise, factual mind to dissect every single sentence line by line, word by word, with the cold efficiency of a surgeon. By 3:00 Sunday morning, his eyes were bloodshot, his throat was dry, and his back was locked in a dull, throbbing pain. The kitchen light flickered relentlessly, casting long, eerie shadows across the legal pads. Armed with nothing but a black ink pen and a stack of yellow legal pads, Marcus began drafting his responses. For every predatory question Vance had hidden in the text, Marcus unearthed a specific federal consumer protection statute to block it. He worked through the sunrise, through the quiet Sunday afternoon, and straight into the dead of Sunday night. He didn't sleep for 44 consecutive hours. His hands trembled from the massive doses of cheap caffeine, and his brain felt like it was floating in fog, but his mind remained sharp as a razor. On Monday morning, at exactly 8:42 a.m., Richard Vance's lead associate, Julian Vance, was sitting in his high-rise office, sipping an artisanal latte, fully expecting a phone call of surrender from the West Side. Instead, the heavy glass doors of the firm's lobby slid open. Marcus Sterling walked in. He looked exhausted, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes ringed with dark gray circles. But his back was straight, his chin was up, and he carried a single, neatly tied bundle of legal filings. He walked directly to Julian's desk, lifted the heavy stack of perfectly formatted, legally airtight responses, and slammed them down onto the polished wood, right next to the associate's expensive coffee cup. Every single request has been answered, objected to, and filed with the federal clerk, Marcus said, his voice quiet, calm, and terrifyingly steady. Not a single deadline was missed. Tell Mr. Vance that his paperwork didn't work. I'll see him at the depositions tomorrow morning. Julian Vance stared at the stack of documents, his mouth opening slightly in absolute disbelief. He quickly flipped through the pages, searching for a single missing signature, a single procedural error, a single late stamp. There was nothing. It was a flawless piece of high-level legal craftsmanship, completed by one man in 48 hours. For the very first time since the lawsuit was filed, a tiny flicker of genuine worry crossed Julian's face. He realized that the broke black attorney from the West Side wasn't just surviving the war, he was adapting to it. But Richard Vance wasn't done. The celebrity lawyer had dozens of dirtier, more vicious traps waiting for Marcus at the upcoming depositions, and he was fully prepared to break Marcus's dignity once and for all. The deposition room on the top floor of the Vance, Sterling, and Associates Tower was designed to intimidate. One entire wall consisted of floor-to-ceiling glass looking down onto the freezing gray waters of Lake Michigan. In the center sat a polished mahogany table that could seat 20 people. At one end sat Richard Vance, wearing an impeccably tailored Navy suit, flanked by Julian Vance and two senior corporate litigation specialists. In the corner, a certified court reporter sat with her fingers poised over the keys of a stenography machine. At the opposite end sat Marcus Sterling and his star witness, 82-year-old Mrs. Elijah. The room was freezing. Vance had deliberately instructed his assistant to turn the building's central air conditioning system down to 60 degrees. Mrs. Elijah sat shivering in her thin, worn wool cardigan, her fragile, arthritic hands clutching a tissue. Marcus had placed his old, scratched cassette recorder in the middle of the table to log the audio. Richard Vance didn't waste a second. Before the court reporter even announced the start of the session, Vance reached over to pour himself a glass of crystal-clear ice water. With a slow, calculated movement, Ga tipped his hand. The heavy crystal pitcher wobbled, and a torrent of ice-cold water spilled directly across the table, washing straight over Marcus's old cassette recorder. The ancient plastic machine sputtered, its internal gears groaning before the red recording light flickered out completely. "Oh, my deepest apologies," Richard Vance said, his voice dripping with an insincere, mocking drawl. Ga didn't look sorry at all. Ga was smiling. "How incredibly clumsy of me. But I suppose a solo attorney using such ancient, pathetic equipment is already accustomed to having his evidence disappear into thin air, isn't he? Julian, get a paper towel. We wouldn't want Miss Elijah's cheap cardigan to get damp." Marcus felt a hot spike of fury surge through his chest. He looked down at the ruined machine, then up into Vance's arrogant blue eyes. "The deposition will proceed, Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice flat and tight. "The court reporter's transcript will suffice, and I suggest you keep your hands to yourself." Vance's smile hardened into a cold, predatory grimace. Ga turned his attention to Mrs. Elijah. For the next 4 consecutive hours, without a single break for water or a restroom visit, Vance subjected the elderly woman to a brutal, merciless interrogation. Ga didn't ask about the fraudulent eviction notices or the Vanguard Corp construction plans. Instead, Ga dug into her personal life with weaponized cruelty. "Mrs. Elijah, isn't it true that your late husband received a government welfare check in 1974? Vance shouted, leaning across the mahogany table until he was inches from her face. "Is it true your grandson was arrested 12 years ago? Answer the question. How can you claim to be a reliable matriarch for this building when your own family is a textbook definition of urban decay? Look at me when I speak to you. Are you experiencing memory loss due to your advanced age? Or are you simply lying under oath to protect your free housing?" "Objection! Harassment!" Marcus roared, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "This has absolutely zero relevance to the property title." "It speaks to her credibility, counselor," Vance shot back, slamming his hand onto the table. "Sit down and shut your mouth. I am running this room." Mrs. Elijah began to tremble violently, tears spilling over her wrinkled cheeks as she looked around the hostile room. She looked small, terrified, and completely broken by the sheer, unbridled power of the corporate machinery surrounding her. Marcus looked at her weeping, and the anger inside him solidified into something cold, heavy, and dangerous. He realized Vance wasn't trying to find information. Ga was trying to break their spirit. But Marcus refused to break. He reached over, gently took Mrs. Elijah's shaking hand in his own, and looked directly into Vance's eyes with a gaze that didn't waver by a millimeter. The battle was no longer just about a building. It was about basic human dignity. The corporate machinery did not stop at the deposition room. On Thursday morning, just 5 days before the decisive federal hearing, Marcus arrived at his narrow West Side office to find 3 burly men in industrial jumpsuits throwing his filing cabinets, his old law books, and his metal desk directly onto the rain-slicked pavement of Pulaski Road. Standing on the sidewalk was his landlord, holding a signed eviction notice from a corporate holding company. "Vanguard Corp. Bought out your entire building's lease yesterday morning, Sterling," the landlord muttered, refusing to meet Marcus's eyes. "They paid triple the market value, on the condition that you are removed from the premises immediately. I'm sorry, but I can't fight billionaires." Before Marcus could even process the loss of his office, his phone buzzed with an automated alert from his banking application. His sole checking account, which held exactly $382 meant for his mother's prescription heart medications, had been completely frozen. Richard Vance had filed an emergency ex parte motion in a separate state court, claiming Marcus's frivolous lawsuit was causing irreparable economic damage to Vanguard Corp., obtaining a temporary asset freezing injunction. Marcus stood in the pouring rain, staring at his phone screen. He didn't even have $20 to buy gasoline to drive his mother to her medical clinic. He was a lawyer with no office, no money, and no resources, standing alone on a wet sidewalk. The final humiliation came on the morning of the federal hearing. The sky over Chicago was a dark, oppressive slate gray. Marcus arrived at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse early, his faded suit damp from walking 6 blocks from the train station. As he stepped into the grand marble corridor outside Courtroom 2100, he found a wall of reporters and television cameras. Richard Vance was already there, surrounded by his massive legal team. Gaume was in the middle of an interview with a prominent legal news network. When Gaume spotted Marcus walking toward the courtroom doors carrying his single, battered leather folder, Vance deliberately raised his voice so every camera and microphone would capture his words. "Look at this, ladies and gentlemen." Vance laughed out loud, pointing his gold-plated pen directly at Marcus's worn shoes. "This is the grand defense of the West Side. Vanguard Corporation is trying to build a $55 million state-of-the-art commercial center that will provide hundreds of jobs. And this completely broke, unqualified solo attorney is holding up progress. Look at that suit. The boy looks like he's about to ask for spare change, not argue a federal property injunction. He doesn't even have an office anymore. The court isn't a charity ward, Marcus. Outfits like yours belong in a mugshot, not arguing before a federal judge. Money and experience always win in this building. You never stood a chance." The surrounding corporate lawyers burst into cruel, mocking laughter. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and the television cameras zoomed in on Marcus's face. He stood there, completely exposed, enduring the public degradation as the heat of 100 flashing bulbs burned into his skin. He was utterly isolated. Not a single major law firm in the entire state of Illinois had agreed to co-counsel with him. The mere mention of Richard Vance's name had caused them to slam their doors. When the courtroom doors finally opened, Marcus walked to his car during a brief pretrial recess, sat in the driver's seat, and turned off the engine. The silence inside the vehicle was suffocating. He pressed his forehead hard against the cold leather of the steering wheel and closed his eyes. For the first time in his entire life, hot, bitter tears of utter defeat escaped his eyelids. The sheer, unbridled malice of the system was crushing him like a stone. He felt completely hollow. He couldn't protect his office, he couldn't protect his bank account, and he couldn't protect his mother from the cold reach of Vance's power. The temptation to just drive away, to disappear, and to let Vanguard Corp have the building was an overwhelming wave of exhaustion in his chest. Then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from Kendra, who was sitting inside the hospital room with his mother. It read, "Your mom just woke up. She said to tell you, She remembers the day you passed the bar. She said your father would be proud because you always stand up for the people who have nobody else. Don't look back, Marcus. Marcus stared at the glowing text on the screen. To his eyes, the message was a crisp arrangement of pure white characters against a solid black background. No distracting colors, no illusions, just the absolute unyielding truth. The fog of despair suddenly vanished from his mind, replaced by an icy, diamond-sharp clarity. He wiped his face, straightened his tie, and stepped out of the car. He wasn't going to run. He was going back into that courtroom, and he was going to turn Richard Vance's 40-year empire into dust. The great hunt began in the dead of the night, inside the small, cramped kitchen of Marcus's apartment. With his office gone and his bank account frozen, his kitchen table had become his war room. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting long, stark shadows over 3,000 pages of Vanguard Corp's internal corporate disclosures. Marcus sat in the absolute silence, his eyes burning with exhaustion, a cold cup of black coffee sitting untouched beside him. He didn't look at the slick, glossy brochures Vance had presented to the media. Instead, he forced his mind back into the habits of a master legal technician. He began to dissect Vanguard Corp's audited financial statements from 15 years ago, documents that Vance's junior associates had buried deep inside the digital appendices, assuming a solo neighborhood attorney would never bother to read them. Marcus analyzed the texts with a surgeon's eye, looking for the one loose thread that, if pulled, would cause the entire multi-billion-dollar apparatus to unravel. At 2:41 a.m., his eyes locked onto a single faded line of text on page 2814 of the financial disclosures. It was a line-item entry for an environmental clearance report regarding the Greenwood Apartments property, dated the 14th of August 2011. Beneath the entry was a digital scanned image of a signature authorizing the immediate transfer of redevelopment funds. Marcus stopped breathing. He stared at the signature. It was the bold, looping cursive of Richard Vance himself, acting as the primary legal counsel for the project. Marcus blinked, his factual mind instantly calculating the timeline. Vanguard Corp's own public property deed loudly claimed that they had purchased the Greenwood Apartments land from the city in March of 2014. Marcus leaned forward until his nose was inches from the paper. "Impossible," he whispered into the empty room. How could Richard Vance sign a legal authorization to develop a property on behalf of Vanguard Corp in 2011, when the corporation didn't legally buy or own the land until 3 years later? His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't an administrative typo. This was a structural impossibility. Marcus pulled out his old, slow laptop, its cracked hinge groaning as he booted up the federal court database and the Cook County Public Records Archive. For the next 4 hours, he followed the digital paper trail through a labyrinth of shell companies, hidden trusts, and offshore corporate registrations. What he uncovered in the dark, silent hours of Sunday morning was a massive, subterranean, criminal conspiracy. Vanguard Corp had never legally bought the Greenwood Apartments land from the city in 2014. Instead, Richard Vance had established a fraudulent offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Aegis Holdings, a trust whose sole beneficiary was Vance's own 28-year-old son, Julian Vance. In 2011, Vanguard Corp had quietly funneled $1.5 million into that Cayman account. In exchange, Vance used his massive political influence to falsify the city's land registry documents, creating a fake historical title to trick the federal court into approving the forced relocation of the black residents. The celebrity lawyer hadn't just bent the rules to win for 40 years. He had been operating a criminal syndicate disguised as a prestigious law firm. Gah had forged the very foundation of his client's ownership. Marcus sat back in his wooden chair, his hands shaking slightly from a mixture of shock and profound adrenaline. He knew that if he brought this evidence to light normally, during discovery, Vance would use his immense network of corrupt officials to suppress the files, bury the records, or file endless procedural motions to delay the trial until the Greenwood building was already demolished. The element of absolute, blinding surprise was the only weapon Marcus had left. He had to walk into the federal courthouse and drop this bomb directly in front of a live judge, with the cameras rolling, where Vance couldn't escape. Before the sun rose, Marcus made a single, desperate phone call to a retired federal forensic accountant whom Vance had ruined a decade earlier. He spent the remaining hours of the night organizing his cross-examination into a lethal, trapdoor sequence on his yellow legal pad. Every single question was mapped to a verifiable public transaction. Every fact was a brick wall closing in on Vance's career. As the first light of Monday morning broke through the kitchen window, Marcus stood up and walked to his bedroom drawer. He pulled out his old, faded Columbia Law School alumni directory and a black briefcase he had borrowed from Kendra. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He looked exhausted, his skin pale, his jaw tense. But the fear was completely gone. Ga had spent 40 years building an empire on lies, and Marcus was about to destroy it with 5 minutes of truth. The air inside Courtroom 2100 was thick with anticipation on Monday morning. Every single seat in the gallery was occupied by local residents, corporate executives, and journalists from the Chicago Tribune. Richard Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, relaxed and smiling, casually polishing his gold cufflinks. He had just delivered a brilliant, theatrical, 30-minute opening statement, painting Vanguard Corp as a benevolent empire, bringing economic salvation to a broken neighborhood. When the federal judge, Honorable Evelyn Thorne, turned her sharp eyes toward the defense table, Marcus Sterling stood up calmly. He did not carry a mountain of exhibit boxes. He carried only a single, ordinary folder. "The defense may proceed with its presentation," Judge Thorne announced, her voice echoing off the high wood-paneled walls. Marcus walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, directly approaching the podium. He did not look at the media cameras or the smirking associates behind Vance. He looked straight at Richard Vance, his face a mask of absolute, icy composure. "Thank you, Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice surprisingly deep and completely devoid of fear. "Mr. Vance has spent a great deal of time talking about contracts, progress, and the inevitable march of development. But a contract is only as valid as the truth upon which it is built. I would like to introduce Defense Exhibit Multi-09, which is the internal corporate wire ledger of Vanguard Corporation from August of 2011. Richard Vance let out a soft, dismissive chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "Your Honor." "Objection," Vance said smoothly, not even bothered to stand up. "This document was not part of the core historical property deed. It is completely irrelevant to a standard modern property injunction hearing." "Overruled, Mr. Vance," Judge Thorne replied, gesturing to Marcus. "I will allow the defense to lay its foundation. Proceed, Mr. Sterling." Marcus opened his folder and pulled out a single, stark document. Because of his total colorblindness, Marcus saw the world in absolute shades of structure and contrast. He looked down at the paper and picked up a heavy neon highlighter, drawing a thick, bold stroke directly across a specific line item. To Marcus's eyes, this stroke appeared as a solid, dark gray line of geometric precision. But to everyone else in the courtroom, it was a glowing, blood-red quang streak that screamed for attention. Marcus slipped the paper under the digital court projector, flashing the magnified image onto the giant monitors on the wall. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, turning his body completely toward the celebrity lawyer, "can you explain to this court why, on the 14th of August 2011, Vanguard Corporation wired exactly $1.5 million to an offshore account at the Bank of Cayman, registered under a shell entity known as Aegis Holdings?" Richard Vance's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his posture stiffening. "I am the legal counsel for Vanguard, not their accountant, Mr. Sterling. Corporate investments are none of your concern. Let's make it your concern, then, Marcus snapped, his voice sharp as a whip. He pulled out a second document, slamming it onto the projector. This is the unredacted corporate registry for Aegis Holdings in the Cayman Islands, obtained through an international financial disclosure database at 4:00 a.m. this morning. The sole designated beneficiary of this entity is Julian Vance, your junior associate and your biological son. And right beneath his name is the legal authorization signature for the initial wire transfer. The courtroom suddenly went dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe. Julian Vance, sitting right next to his father, instantly went entirely pale, his eyes widening in pure horror as his own signature flashed across the federal court monitors. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his words falling like heavy iron blocks into the quiet room. The date on this wire transfer matches the exact day you signed a non-disclosure clearance form, certifying that the city's public land registry had cleared the Greenwood property for development. You didn't win cases for 40 years because of your legal brilliance, Mr. Vance. You won because you were bribery cleared. You created a fake historical title to steal this land from 150 black families, and you paid your own son to hide the blood money. Richard Vance stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair flew backward, crashing loudly against the wooden railing. His face turned a deep, furious crimson, his veins bulging against his stiff white collar. This is an absolute outrage. This is an unverified, fabricated ambush. Your Honor, I demand an immediate 3-week recess to review these ridiculous, libelous allegations. Sit down, Mr. Vance, Judge Thorne roared, slamming her heavy wooden gavel down 3 times with a force that shook the bench. You will not dictate the schedule of this court. Mr. Sterling, do you have a witness to verify the authenticity of these banking records? Marcus looked directly at the heavy double doors at the back of the room. I do, Your Honor. The defense calls Senior Special Agent Arthur Pendleton from the Federal Forensic Audit Division. As the double doors swung open and a stone-faced federal agent walked into the room carrying a certified government briefcase, Richard Vance froze completely. The celebrity lawyer stood paralyzed in the center of the room, his jaw dropping open, looking at the agent like he was staring at a ghost. His 40-year fortress of arrogance had just been breached, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. The moment Senior Special Agent Arthur Pendleton took the witness stand, the entire dynamic of the federal courtroom shifted from a civil property dispute into a full-blown criminal exposure. The agent opened his certified government briefcase with a crisp, metallic click that echoed through the silent room. One by one, he produced the original, encrypted banking records and certified wire receipts that Marcus had unearthed in the dark hours of the morning. Each document bore the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. Agent Pendleton, Marcus said, standing at the center of the room, his voice steady and calm. Based on your forensic analysis of these accounts, who had administrative control over the Aegis Holdings entity during the forced relocation of the Greenwood residents? The administrative control was traced directly to a private IP address registered at the personal residence of Richard Vance. Agent Pendleton testified, looking directly at the defense table. The funds transferred from Vanguard Corporation were systematically layered through 3 offshore accounts before being withdrawn as cash by Julian Vance. It is a textbook definition of money laundering and federal bribery. Richard Vance did not stand up to object this time. Gon sat completely motionless, his face drained of all color, turning an ash gray that matched the stormy sky outside the tall windows. Ga looked entirely empty, his expensive navy suit suddenly appearing loose and oversized on his slumping shoulders. His hands trembled violently as he tried to pick up his gold pen, but it slipped from his slick, sweaty fingers and rolled across the mahogany table, clicking softly against his laptop. "Mr. Vance," Judge Thorne said, her voice dropping into an icy, terrifying tone. "Do you wish to cross-examine this witness?" Vance cleared his throat twice, trying to summon the booming, arrogant voice that had dominated the state for 40 years. But when he spoke, only a thin, broken whisper came out. "No, no further questions, Your Honor." "Very well," Judge Thorne said. She slowly removed her reading glasses, set them down on the bench, and leaned forward. The room was so quiet that the faint, rhythmic buzzing of the old fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a siren. "Mr. Sterling, you may deliver your closing remarks." Marcus walked to the front of the courtroom. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't use a script. He stood before the bench, a solo black attorney who had been evicted from his office, whose bank account had been frozen, and who had been publicly humiliated in front of the world's media just hours ago. He looked at the gallery, where Mrs. Elijah and dozens of Greenwood residents sat holding hands, their eyes filled with tears of sudden, overwhelming hope. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "For 40 years, Richard Vance has walked into the courts of this country claiming that he was undefeated. God believed that the size of his corporate firm, the wealth of his clients, and the color of my skin determined the outcome of the law. God believed that if you have enough money, you can buy the very ground beneath a poor person's feet and erase their history from the record. God treated the law as a club to beat the weak, rather than a shield to protect them." Marcus turned around slowly, pointing his hand directly at the frozen celebrity lawyer. But God was wrong. The law does not belong to the highest bidder. It does not care about your high-rise glass offices, your custom suits, or your 40-year record of intimidation. Pham gia qua con ngui hong for thwork vào dir vir haitian back. Today, the truth has shown up, and it refuses to disappear. The silence that followed Marcus's words was heavy, profound, and absolute. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then, Judge Evelyn Thorne stood up from her leather chair. The entire courtroom rose with her in unison. She looked down at Richard Vance with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "This court has heard more than enough," Judge Thorne announced, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "The plaintiff's motion for a permanent eviction order is denied. Furthermore, based on the overwhelming evidence of criminal fraud, perjury, forgery, and federal bribery presented by the defense, this entire civil action is dismissed with prejudice. Vanguard Corporation will never be permitted to bring a claim against the Greenwood property again." The judge slammed her gavel down with a final booming crash that signaled the permanent end of Vanguard's $55 million project. But she wasn't finished. "Mr. Vance," Judge Thorne said, her eyes locking onto the trembling lawyer, "I am formally referring your conduct and the conduct of your associate Julian Vance to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution. I am also issuing an emergency order to the Illinois State Bar to suspend your license to practice law, effective in the next 60 seconds. You are a disgrace to this profession. Bailiffs, secure the corporate financial files immediately. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down one last time, and the courtroom instantly erupted into an absolute chaos of sound. Journalists bolted for the doors to scream the news to their editors, while from the back of the gallery, a loud, thunderous roar of cheering and sobbing broke out from the residents of Greenwood. Richard Vance remained pinned to his seat, staring blankly at his trembling hands, watching 40 years of reputation, power, and wealth vanish into thin air in less than 60 seconds. Ga had played the game of arrogance for a lifetime, but Ga had finally met a man who couldn't be bought, and the cost of his defeat was everything Ga owned. The aftermath of the federal hearing was a sudden, unstoppable collapse that tore through the highest levels of Chicago's legal and financial circles like a Category 5 hurricane. Within 48 hours of Judge Thorne's devastating referral, federal agents from the FBI and IRS Criminal Investigation Division raided the penthouse offices of Vance, Sterling, and Associates. They seized dozens of hard drives, bank statements, and historical title records, uncovering a vast network of corporate corruption that spanned over 2 decades. Richard Vance, the celebrity attorney who had boasted of a 40-year undefeated streak, was formally arrested at his multi-million-dollar mansion in Lake Forest. The media cameras that Gaw had once used to humiliate Marcus were now lined up outside the federal building to capture a very different image. Richard Vance, dressed in a plain, oversized orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled behind his back, his head bowed to avoid the flashing bulbs. Following a swift federal trial, Vance was convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy, wire fraud, perjury, and federal bribery. He was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary and ordered to pay a personal penalty of $4 million. His law license was stripped away permanently, his name erased from the state bar registry with a single, definitive stroke of a pen. His son, Julian Vance, narrowly avoided a long prison sentence by agreeing to cooperate fully with the federal prosecutors. He submitted a formal letter of resignation to the bar and voluntarily transitioned into an administrative role at a public defender's office, completely abandoning the corporate world. In his final private communication to a local news outlet, Julian wrote a single, telling sentence, "I spent my entire youth watching people with everything destroy people with nothing, but in that courtroom, I saw the truth dismantle an empire, and I realized I had been standing on the wrong side of humanity." Vanguard Corporation fared no better. Facing a massive class action lawsuit organized by Marcus on behalf of the Greenwood residents, the multi-billion-dollar conglomerate was forced to settle for a staggering $25 million in punitive damages. The $55 million luxury development project was completely abandoned, and the historic Greenwood apartments were legally placed into a permanent community land trust, ensuring that the 150 low-income black families would never face forced relocation again. On the afternoon the final settlement papers were signed, Marcus Sterling did not attend any high-profile press conferences or celebratory galas. He walked out of the Dirksen Federal Courthouse alone, carrying his old leather briefcase. He walked 6 blocks through the biting Chicago wind, stepped into his old sedan, and closed the doors, cutting off the sound of the city. He didn't call the reporters who had been spamming his phone all day. He didn't check his banking application, which now showed his frozen account had been completely restored, alongside a substantial court-ordered fee award from Vanguard Corp. Marcus simply leaned forward, pressed his forehead against the worn leather of the steering wheel, and let out a long, shuddering breath. For 15 minutes, he sat in the quiet vehicle, his eyes closed, crying soft, silent tears of overwhelming relief. The crushing stone that had sat on his chest for months had finally been lifted. He could finally look his mother in the eyes and tell her that their home was safe, that their dignity was intact, and that the long, dark winter of their struggle was finally over. 6 months later, the corner of Pulaski Road on the west side looked entirely different. The narrow, run-down brick building where Marcus had once struggled to keep the lights on had been completely renovated. The old, faded awning was gone, replaced by a clean, modern sign featuring crisp black letters that stood out boldly against a pristine cream background. It read, "The Sterling Community Justice Center." Inside, the narrow rooms had been opened up, the old, buzzing fluorescent lights replaced by warm, steady LED lamps that flooded the space with a calm, welcoming light. The worn-out carpet had been replaced with beautiful, polished hardwood floors. A large, wooden table stood near the entrance, covered in neat stacks of intake forms, consumer rights brochures, and a bowl of fresh peppermints for walk-in clients. Mrs. Elijah sat in a comfortable armchair in the reception area, knitting a dark wool blanket, her face relaxed and smiling as she greeted neighbors who walked through the door. Kendra stood near a row of new metal filing cabinets, organizing files for 3 young pro bono law students who had volunteered to intern for the winter semester. Marcus stood at the front of the main office, wearing a new, well-fitted charcoal blazer that sat perfectly on his shoulders. He looked out through the clean glass windows at the bustling Chicago street, watching a young mother push a stroller past the newly opened center. He turned back to the room, smoothed his jacket, and looked at a group of single mothers and elderly tenants who were waiting at the table with folders of paperwork they didn't understand. Marcus smiled, his eyes warm, steady, and completely at peace. "Welcome, everyone," he said, his voice carrying a quiet, unshakable authority. "My name is Marcus Sterling, and I am here to help you fight." Life lesson. This incredible journey reminds us that true power does not reside in the thickness of a wallet, the prestige of a law firm, or the arrogance of a 40-year reputation. Human dignity is a sacred, unyielding force that cannot be bought, sold, or intimidated into silence. When you stand flat-footed on the foundation of truth and absolute preparation, no amount of money or prejudice can ever take your worth away. If this powerful story of justice, resilience, and human dignity touched your heart today, please leave a comment below with your thoughts and share it with someone who needs the strength to keep fighting their own battles right now. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring journey with us. Keep standing tall, look after one another, and we will see you in the next story.